Giovanni Boccaccio was born in 1313 in Florence, in an area that is today Tuscany in Italy. And scholars consider him to have been one of the most important European writers of the 14th century, and perhaps the best prose writer of that time. He wrote mostly in the Tuscan vernacular, rather than in Latin, as was common. And while Boccaccio is known, among other things, as being a humanist, the decision to write in the vernacular, the decision itself, contributed to the spread of knowledge in Europe, and it could be viewed as a humanistic act. Though, of course, he was not the only person doing this. He was an early example of it. And if you have more people learning how to read, because learning how to read is already sort of difficult, particularly in the 14th century, and if you don't at the same time have to learn a different language, like Latin, if you are learning instead to read a language that you already know how to speak, that's obviously much easier to do, and literacy in general is one of the foundational things that contributed to the spread of knowledge and the development of knowledge and science and culture in Europe. So while Latin is good for a different reason, it's good as a unifying force, the vernacular is also good. While we like it when we hear that Chaucer and Boccaccio wrote in the vernacular, because that meant that more ordinary people could read it, it creates the problem that if Chaucer had written in Latin, then educated people in Italy would be able to read his writing, whereas since he wrote in vernacular Middle English, now more ordinary people in England can read and understand his stories. They have to be literate at least, or maybe somebody could read them to them. But now the educated person in Italy can't anymore. So it's a bit of a trade-off. And speaking of Chaucer, Boccaccio's writing inspired and influenced both Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, at which we will be looking in a few weeks, and Miguel de Cervantes, author of Don Quixote. Boccaccio is also considered, alongside Dante Alighieri and Francesco Petrarch, to be one of the three crowns, is what they're called, of Italian literature. And aside from being very early, significant writers in Italian, not just Italian writers, but writers in Italian, these are three guys to whose writing Pietro Bembo, who lived much later in the 15th and 16th centuries, looked in developing the Tuscan dialect as a literary language. And people who study the development of Italian say that modern Italian, to a great extent, came through this path. That there were these three writers. This guy, Pietro Bembo, sort of combined what they were doing to develop it further, and a lot of modern Italian comes out of that. I don't speak Italian, so I don't know, but sounds plausible. Boccaccio was also a student of Petrarch. We'll get into a little bit about how they met a little later. And he spent time copying out copies, codices is what they were called, of Dante's Divine Comedy. And as a side note, Dante's famous work, at which we looked a month or so ago, was originally just called The Comedy, but it was Boccaccio who thought it needed a better, more grandiose title to suit its celestial subject matter, and he gave it the title The Divine Comedy, and that's what has stuck. But Boccaccio started out in different professions. He started out in banking, and he didn't like that very much, and then he worked as a lawyer for a while, and he didn't like that very much either. And as an adult, he found what he considered his true vocation, which was writing and poetry. In 1350, he got involved in the government of Florence, and he was sent around, much like Dante was, as a kind of a diplomat, though Boccaccio went to more local places. If you look at the two men's diplomatic itineraries, it seems that Dante might have been a bit higher up in the hierarchy. He was going to France and to visit the Holy Roman Emperor specifically, whereas Boccaccio went to Romagna a few times, he went to Milan, he went to Avignon, and he went to Brandenburg. Though I'm not sure, maybe his political work was actually more significant. But since Dante's work included the courts of kings, and his political life included banishment from cities and threats of execution and threats of the execution of his sons and other things, I'm inclined to think that he was more of a political actor than Boccaccio was. Though Boccaccio also, he had this political work in his background, which is interesting. Of those three Italians that we mentioned, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, something that two of them have quite distinctly in common is the effort to resurrect literature and language from antiquity. Petrarch, of course, is credited with rediscovering Cicero's letters, which many people think was a very significant development in the beginning of the Italian Renaissance. And Boccaccio promoted the study of the Greek language in Florence, and he also he used some of his influence to try to set up housing for a monk and a scholar named Barlaam of Seminara, who by 1351 had been accused of heresy in southern Italy. So he wound up in Florence, and Boccaccio got housing for him and also encouraged him to translate Homer, Euripides, and Aristotle. And to add to that a little bit more, Boccaccio's interest in ancient Greek literature. The name of the text that we're going to be looking at today, the Decameron, comes from Greek. Deca means 10, and hemera means day. So decahemera, 10 days. And that's because, as we'll see, the main action of the story takes place over 10 days. And now that name doesn't stand out too much to us, either because we're familiar with that name, or because when we think of the European literary canon and the writing that's in it, a number of those writings, those texts, have titles with Greek names. And so we think of this one alongside those, except that this one is out of place, both in time and geography, with most of the other ones, or at least many of them. It wasn't tremendously fashionable in 14th century Italy to write a poem in Italian and to give it a Greek name. But as we've seen, Boccaccio had a particular interest in ancient Greek and the writings of antiquity, and so he clearly wanted to use that for the title of this piece of writing, which is the major work of his life. And he had begun working on the Decameron in about 1349, and by 1352 it was more or less completed. And then in 1370 and 1371, toward the end of his life, he revised it, and that revised version is the one that we read today, and that manuscript is still extant. But before getting more into the Decameron, we can talk a little bit more about his life. In 1350, he was appointed to greet Petrarch as he entered Florence, as Petrarch came to visit Florence. I tried to figure out where Petrarch would have been coming from, but I couldn't. But anyway, he came to Florence, and Boccaccio's task was to greet Petrarch when he visited and to host him at his home while he stayed in Florence. And they immediately became friends, and Petrarch encouraged Boccaccio to study classical Greek and Latin literature. And it's possible that that's where some of Boccaccio's enthusiasm on this topic came from, though maybe he was already interested, I'm not sure. There are at least two other texts that Boccaccio is best known for. One of them is called On Famous Women, and it's apparently a collection of biographies of notable women from history. And I've never read it, but I'd like to read it. That might be a nice text to publish, because I'd never heard of it before last year sometime, and I've certainly never seen it in print. But I've also never read it, so I'd like to see what's in there. That might be a nice little project. And he also wrote something called On the Genealogy of the Gods of the Gentiles, which he finished in 1360. And it was a key encyclopedia on the intricacies of the families of Roman and Greek gods that was the major text on this subject for about 4 centuries. As we've talked about, Boccaccio believed that there was a lot to learn from ancient Greece and Rome, despite them being pagan and not Christian. And this book of his defended the study of ancient literature and thinking. And this was controversial at the time because there were many clerics who thought that reading anything except Christian writing would corrupt the morals, would warp the faith of Christians. And of course, as we've talked about before on this podcast, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again, it was in part this rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman thinking that led to the Renaissance, not only in Petrarch and him rediscovering Cicero, but translations of Aristotle and lots of other things. So Boccaccio, I can imagine with this book, also contributed to that movement, as he did with several other things, encouraging the monk that they housed in Florence and the other things we discussed. In 1361, there was a failed coup in Florence, and many of Boccaccio's friends were executed or imprisoned. There's no evidence that he was involved in the attempt, but he was much less involved in government, and he left Florence and went to his hometown of Certaldo. And again, he revised the Decameron in 1370 and 1371, so this would have been during this period after he had left Florence and was getting older and maybe had more time to work on his writing. And in 1375, he died in Certaldo, which, by the way, is a town in Florence. He died there, and his library was given to the monastery of Santo Spirito, which is also in Florence, and his library is still there to this day. The Decameron, as we've said, was written in the Tuscan dialect. It is what's called a frame story, which means that there's an overarching story and then there's a lot of stories within that. Another well-known example of this is the 1001 Nights. It's very similar. You have the frame story of Scheherazade telling stories to stay her execution, but the 1001 Nights has the added dynamic of there being stories within stories, that she starts to tell a story, and then a character in the story starts to tell a story, and then a character in that story starts to tell a story, and so it becomes like a bunch of Matryoshka dolls. The Decameron is a bit more straightforward than that. The frame story is that there are 7 women and 3 men who are sheltering in a villa during the Black Plague. The Black Plague is, of course, from 1346 to 1353, and Boccaccio was also writing during that period. As we said, he was writing mostly from 1349 to 1352, this initial draft of the Decameron, this initial version of it, rather. So he was writing while the plague was devastating Europe. And to pass the time, they tell 100 stories. Each of the 10 people tells 1 story per day, and the stories are always on a given theme that's decided by the king or queen for that day. And the king or queen, the role of king or queen rotates, and that person is the one who decides what the theme is going to be and occasionally passes judgment on whether somebody can bend a rule or something like that. And they don't tell stories on weekends or on holidays. So though there are only 10 days of storytelling, it takes about 2 weeks for them to tell the stories. And it's worth noting that Girolamo Savonarola, who lived much later, an Italian religious leader, in his Bonfire of the Vanities, this burning of what he and his followers viewed as sinful art, they burned the Decameron, along with many other things, and that was in 1497. And the reason for that is pretty clear when you read it, and we'll get into that. You can imagine that in 100 stories, the book covers a lot of themes. There's a lot about communication, meaning how in medieval times, if you want to discreetly get a message to somebody, how can you get it to them? And there's a lot about miscommunication, people misunderstanding what's going on, mistaken identity, thinking someone is somebody when they're in fact someone else. There's a lot of trickery, there's a lot of secrecy, there's a lot about religion, there's a lot of jokes, there's a lot about the clergy, it's a lot of anti-clerical stuff about friars and nuns. They are very different lengths. Some of them are very short, almost like a joke that you would tell, and some of them go on for pages, the stories. I get why people connect this to humanism. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. There are a lot of executions in the stories. There are occasional stays of execution. There are dreams and visions, prophetic dreams. There's discussion of friendship, of fate, humans as the playthings of fortune. There's accusations of witchcraft. There are supernatural and infernal punishments. Most of the stories stay fairly grounded in what you could expect as being real. There are only a few that have elements of them that are supernatural or religious. There are some good life lessons. There are some brief notes about etiquette, what to do in certain social situations. And there is a surprising amount of sex. It's always covered up in veiled language and double entendre, but it's occasionally downright raunchy. It would be reasonable to take Boccaccio as an early, if not possibly the first example of a writer of short stories. Now, perhaps the reason people do not usually consider him to be the first short story writer is because this is a frame story. It's a unified story that has stories in it. But the stories are almost entirely vignettes from ordinary human life. They pretty much all involve some kind of romance or attempted romance or something. But this is an example of a story or a set of stories in which the main characters are not gods, for example. They're not legends. They're not kings. there are a few kings in the stories, and there is still an ever-present element of social hierarchy. There'll be a girl who likes a guy, but the guy's a prince and she's poor or whatever, and that's a theme. But there are plenty of stories that are just about ordinary peasants and the dramas that they get into. And if we're talking about the 14th century, it's not terribly easy to think of examples earlier than that, including writing from antiquity, that meets this description. And you could say maybe the 1001 Nights. And 1001 Nights is, of course, Middle Eastern, it's not European, but that is generally accepted to have been compiled between the 8th and the 14th centuries. And so, at the latest, it's contemporary to the Decameron. And at the earliest, it's much, much earlier. And you could say, well, those are also stories from everyday life. And so couldn't that be an earlier example of a short story? And there are at least two things that make 1001 Nights different from the Decameron. And the one is that, if I remember correctly, a lot of the stories in 1001 Nights are never resolved. Like I said, you're going along, and then somebody else starts telling another story, and then somebody else starts telling another story within that story, and I don't remember that it ever collapses back and all of the stories starting from the beginning are all resolved. So that's one thing. The stories don't necessarily end, but they don't necessarily have to either. A lot of modern short stories end kind of abruptly, and you're supposed to think whatever you think about them. They don't necessarily follow this arc that they teach you in middle school about writing a story. But the other thing about the 1001 Nights, and I haven't read it in a while, maybe I should read it again, is that I remember there being a lot more magic and jinns and crazy stuff going on, whereas the Decameron is fairly down to earth, which means that the subject matter of the stories, more of the stories in the Decameron, tends to be more centered on ordinary everyday life rather than supernatural things. Another aspect of the Decameron is that it includes the reactions of the hearers of the story. When one of the 10 people is telling a story, the other 9 are listening. And at the end of each story, at the end of most of the stories, Boccaccio takes a second to talk about the reactions of the listeners. Sometimes they're laughing, sometimes they're crying, sometimes they're blushing, sometimes they're debating the stories, which character was right. And in doing that, there is an acknowledgement that literature is something observed by others. It's not exactly breaking the fourth wall because he's not looking out at you as the reader, but the stories are told to an audience, as stories inevitably are, and you see the audience react to them. And the stories are connected to each other not by characters, but by themes or characteristics. On each day of the storytelling, the person who is the king or queen for the day sets the rules for what the stories are going to be about, and we'll look at some of those. And in between each story, there's often a little comment. The next person telling the story will comment on the previous story and say something about how the story that they're going to tell is similar or different or whatever it may be. Of the 10 days on which they're telling these stories, there are set themes for 8 of them. For 2 of them, there aren't really set themes. They're just sort of assorted stories. But some of the other themes are stories about adventures that are going badly and then they have a sudden happy ending, or stories about someone who got something in a very painful way, or they lost it and then regained it. Some of them are about couples whose relationship ends in disaster in some way. Others are about couples whose relationship goes through a bad thing, something happens, and then it turns around and their luck gets better. There's one day that's all about quips, kind of about funny comebacks. And then there's a couple days where wives are playing tricks on their husbands, or men are playing tricks on women, or women are playing tricks on men. And then the last day is a day of stories about munificence, about people being very generous in one way or another. And before and after each day of storytelling, in the evening, they're often singing songs or dancing. In the morning, they're eating food and hanging out in this nice garden that they're in. So there's some other stuff going on around the stories. And there are some interactions and relationships to examine among the storytellers themselves. That's a little more subtle, but you can notice some persistent relations among those storytellers as well. And something that comes up a few times when they're singing those songs at the end of the day is that either one of the men or one of the women will be singing a song of remorse or regret about a person that they loved. And the other characters will wonder who they're talking about. Who is this person that they loved? And that happens a few times as well. Something that's a little different from how we would tell a modern story is that at the beginning of a lot of the stories, the storyteller will give a little commentary. They'll say, well, you just told a story that was like this, but I'm going to tell a story that's like that. And often when they're doing that, they are sort of giving away the ending of the story that they're going to tell in a small way. And it creates actually a different kind of suspense. At first, we would say, why would you do that? You're telling people what's going to happen. The main thing is the surprise ending or the suspense. And this is definitely a different approach, but it creates a different kind of tension because you know that something is going to go well or to go badly, or you often do, but you don't know exactly how. And that creates a kind of different suspense, a different effect, this sort of waiting for the shoe to drop, which is different from the surprise ending. And both of those can be valuable in storytelling. And to say something else about this dynamic of writing stories about ordinary human life rather than about gods or kings is that the Decameron preceded modern philosophy. It came before all of these guys who were trying to figure out what human life is really about. It didn't come before ancient Greek philosophy. It didn't come before Christianity. And ancient Greek philosophy, while it's not Christian, is not exactly atheistic either. And modern philosophy is not necessarily atheistic, but I can see a line that goes from people starting to write about ordinary life, about what happens between peasants when no one else is looking, and then someone being inclined to take that more seriously, to look at it not just peasant life, but ordinary day-to-day human life. What is it about? What are we doing? What's going on? And we often would like to imagine that the abstract analysis would precede the poetical depiction of something. That first we would think about it in the abstract and we'd study it under the microscope, and then later somebody would think to write a poem or a story about it. But it might be the reverse, and in this case it seems like it is, that maybe what happened first was humanism started to develop. And humanism is one of those words that I still don't quite know what it means. I've been hearing it since probably middle school or high school, and I kind of get it. When I read the first paragraph of the Wikipedia page about humanism, I go, yeah, that makes sense, and that's more or less what I expected to read on this page. But why is that significant? And what is it really? I think part of it is this vision of the world that's oriented on human life, on what's good and bad for humans, and starting to depict humans in a normal way as they actually are may have been the first or maybe an early step on the path toward modern philosophy and humanism. Not that humanism is necessarily the ideal goal, but one of the significant aspects of the Decameron. And it's a big book with a lot of stories, and a lot of the stories are similar. There's a lot of romance, there's a lot of cheating wives, and even Boccaccio at the end, he says, some people are going to say that some of these are too long. I say, if you want to skip some of them, skip them. That's fine with me. But it's a relatively large book, and I would be cautious to recommend it to somebody who wasn't really fired up about 14th century Italian literature, which is a great subject, but it's not necessarily for everybody. And as I gradually build my own list of what I think from the canon people should read first, start with these, if you have time, read those. I wouldn't necessarily put the Decameron at the top of the list, because it is kind of a big investment, and the return is not bad, but there might be some other texts that I would put before it. And that being said, this, I think, is one of the significant aspects of the Decameron, this understanding that I'm talking about of how it bridges this gap between Christian theology and the legends of antiquity on the one side, and then early modern philosophy on the other. Not because Erasmus and Thomas More and John Calvin all read the Decameron. I don't know if any of them did. But to start thinking about human life in detail could begin with somebody creating a farcical depiction of it, showing the funny aspects of it, showing the tragic aspects of it. And that would have to be life as it is, not a legendary, idealized form of human life. But now we can talk a little bit about some of the aspects of the stories. A lot of them are very irreverent. They scoff at the sacraments. There's one talking about how there's a Christian guy who's trying to convert a Jew to Christianity, and he's using all these complicated arguments, and the Jew says, well, you know what? I'll at least go and see the Pope, and I'll see how those guys are doing, and then I'll make my decision about becoming Christian or not. And the Christian guy's very worried about this because he knows that the Pope and the clergy are not well behaved. And so then the Jew goes down to Rome, and he sees the Pope, and he sees all the clergy there, and he learns about all the things they get into, all the trouble they get into, all of the sins that they commit. And instead of this totally turning him off from Christianity, what he says is, these guys are supposed to be the ones promoting this religion and making it look good and getting people to convert, but they should immediately make everyone want to run away from it. And yet the religion continues to grow. So this must be a sign. Its growth, despite this terrible leadership, must be a sign of its divinity. And so he does end up becoming Christian. But that's clearly satire. There's a lot like that, a lot of poking fun at religious figures. There's an inquisitor who learns that a guy is rich, and so he really quickly tries to come up with some charge to issue against this rich guy just to get his money. There's a joke about how the clergy always say that whatever you give away, you'll get it back 100 times in heaven. And since they're always giving soup to the poor, somebody says, oh, well, you guys are going to drown in all the soup that you're going to get in paradise. And they're making fun of the fact that these guys get all kinds of money and what they give back is just soup. There's a coven of licentious nuns in one story. And there's an example that shows that Boccaccio viewed an objection to wife beating as very high morality. The context is sort of complicated, but there's a guy who is supposed to be shown as the paragon of morality, and one of the things he objects to is wife beating. And that has to be the oldest documented objection to that I've seen. We're talking about the 14th century. I'll have to think of an older one. There's one crazy story about a beautiful Saracen woman who ends up on the shores of Europe, and she can't speak the language of the place that she's in, but she's so beautiful that she just causes this bloodbath across the Mediterranean. Guys getting into knife fights, they're strangling each other, they're throwing each other out of windows because they all want to have this woman. And while Boccaccio in general seems to favor women, he says at the end that he wrote his story, he wrote the Decameron in order to entertain women, but he observes at one point that women have no idea what they want, so there are little funny flip comments like that. There's at least one story about how jealousy of someone else's good reputation leads first to competition. There's a guy who is known for being very generous, and so this other guy hates that he is known as being more generous than him, and so he tries to be even more generous, and it quickly goes from competition to the guy is planning to kill him. And these stories are not all life lessons, but there are some life lessons in them. And if you wanted to give a young person a textbook about all the different kinds of people that are out there, the Decameron wouldn't be a bad place to start, because it does make you think about how somebody could be tricking you. There's a lot of deception. There's a lot of lying. It makes you think about that even when it's somebody you really think you can trust, or you say they couldn't possibly go to such lengths to deceive me. And in this collection of stories, there's a lot like that. But also, not everybody would imagine that if you're a very kind person, that could drive somebody so crazy. The good reputation you get from being generous and kind, that could drive someone so crazy that they could want to kill you over it. And that might seem a little medieval, but not much. I think that could very easily happen today. And that's a separate thing, by the way, I just thought of it, that I was thinking about when I was reading this. People will often use the phrase, a medieval view of women, to refer to somebody who thinks that women should just stay home and not work and make food and raise children, which, by the way, if a woman prefers that, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But people will talk about a medieval view of women as including that, and maybe the idea that a woman shouldn't have sex before she gets married, or whatever it may be. And these stories go way against that. The women in these stories do not at all fit into this passive image of women in the Middle Ages that at least I had. And these stories are much raunchier than anything I've read from the 19th century. And we have this view of history moving from more tightly controlled sexual behavior in the past to less tightly controlled sexual behavior in the present. And it might not be that simple. It might go up and down in different periods for different reasons. Or at least the appearance in the literature might go up and down for different reasons. Certainly not least of all because of the 1857
Obscene Publications Act in England. But even if you look at Guy de Maupassant, there's romance in those stories, but there's nothing that's as suggestive as Boccaccio, as openly using funny wordplay about specific sexual actions. There are some historical figures that show up in some of the stories. Saladin shows up a couple times, and he's described as very loyal, very kind, very generous, and he remembers favors that were done to him and repays them. And so this shows that his reputation as an honorable leader is not a modern phenomenon. He lived in the 12th century and was a major leader who fought against the Crusaders and eventually took Jerusalem from the Christians. And yet here, only 150 years or so after that, he's being remembered very favorably. And you might expect that the closer you get to the time when he was actually doing his fighting, that's when there would be negative mythology about him. But even then, he was remembered well. There's one clever story about a guy who gets trapped in a tomb because he goes there as a grave robber, and the person he goes with abandons him there. And so then he's stuck in this tomb, and he says, I'm either going to die or somebody's going to come and find me and they're going to hang me for grave robbing. And then another group of grave robbers comes to the same tomb, and somebody's climbing into the tomb, and the guy has the idea to grab that guy by the leg while he's climbing in, because he's climbing in feet first. And the guy who's climbing in, he feels something grab his leg, and he thinks it's a monster or something, or a spirit or a zombie. And he tells his friends, get me out of here. And they pull him out, and then they're all terrified and they all run away, and they have left the door open. And so then the guy gets out, which I thought was pretty clever. There's another story where there's a guy who's complimenting another guy a lot, and he's actually doing it to butter that guy up because he's going to con him somehow. And though a reader might not necessarily be able to take that lesson, if they're paying attention, a young person could read that and say, oh, I better watch out for people who are complimenting me a lot. And that's a good lesson in general. In this book, rather than being very effective, interesting passages, for the most part, I found it interesting to talk about it as a whole, as I've done, and to touch on some of the elements that are in it. Because, one, it's in translation. Two, it's in translation from 670 years ago. So a lot of the text itself was not terribly exciting. But the material and themes and ideas that we've pulled out of it so far got my attention. But there are a few passages that I want to read, so we can look at those now. The first one is, quote, "It is not easy to know what's best for us. I mean, how often has one seen it happen? People think that if only they were rich, they would live a safe, trouble-free life. So they'd pray God to make them wealthy. They'd move heaven and earth. They'd spare themselves no danger, no exertion to acquire a fortune. And once they'd have achieved their object, they'd find someone coming along and murdering them for the sake of their ample possessions. Someone who in the days before they made their fortune would have striven to keep them alive. Others there are of humble stock who would fight 1,000 desperate battles to rise through the blood of their own brothers and friends to the heights of royal dominion, imagining that here they should find the ultimate happiness, only to discover the countless anxieties and fears to be seen lurking there, and to meet their deaths in the realization that what is drunk in the golden goblets at the king's table is poison. Many have there been who above all things longed for physical strength and beauty, or for outward trappings, but scarcely had they realized how misplaced were their ambitions than those very objects became the cause of their death or of enduring misfortune. Rather than go minutely into each one of our human desires, let me state that there's not a single one that a living person might choose deliberately as guaranteeing a happy outcome." End quote. And that makes me think of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, by Samuel Johnson, which we looked at in another episode of this podcast. We go looking for happiness in all these different places, and what Boccaccio says next is that you should just trust God, and whatever he's given you, that's the best thing. And that's one way to look at it. But it's worth it to try to remember to be happy and content where you are. It's good to strive. It's good to try to be better, to do more, to learn more, to be stronger. But wherever you get to, you're going to be dealing with problems there also. And in some cases, they might be worse than where you are now. So enjoy where you are now, too. This next passage is a really pleasant description of the garden that they're in. So if you want, just stop and really try to imagine this. I had a nice time imagining this garden when I was reading this. Quote, "After this, they had a garden open to them which lay adjacent to the house. It was a walled garden, and as they went in, they were struck by its sheer beauty even before they inspected it in any detail. The garden was surrounded and intersected by a great many broad paths, each one straight as an arrow and covered over by trellised vines that gave every promise of producing grapes in abundance that year. They were all in flower and so imbued the garden with their fragrance that, added to all manner of other scents wafting about, they conveyed a sensation of concentrating here every aromatic plant to which the East ever gave birth. The sides of these paths were virtually hemmed in by bushes of red and white roses and jasmine, so that one could walk along any of them in the delicious fragrant shade and be protected from the sun not only in the morning, but even when it was at its zenith. As for the species of plants in the garden, it would take too long to list or enumerate them, or describe how they were arranged. There was not a single good plant that did not proliferate here, provided that it was suited to our climate. By no means one of the least attractive features of the garden was a lawn in the middle of it, a lawn of close-cropped grass that was dark green and dotted with all kinds of flowers. It was surrounded by orange and other citrus trees of the most luscious green foliage, which kept their old fruit along with the new, and remained in blossom, providing not only a pleasant shade for the eyes, but also a delight to the nostrils. At the center of the lawn there was a fountain of gleaming white marble with superbly sculpted reliefs, and in the middle there stood a pillar surmounted by a statue through which a jet of water, whether naturally or artificially induced, sufficient to turn a mill wheel, shot up high into the air to drop most musically into the limpid pool. The surplus water in the fountain was drawn off by a conduit concealed beneath the lawn to re-emerge in the most beautiful and ingenious watercourses that encircled it. Thence the water crisscrossed the garden in a network of similar channels and ultimately was collected at a point where it flowed out to descend to the plain in a crystal stream. Before it reached the plain, however, it applied its immense power to turning a pair of mill wheels, to the not inconsiderable profit of the landowner. The sight of this garden, so beautifully laid out, with its plants and the fountain and the watercourse fed by it, so enchanted the ladies and the three young men. They all insisted that, were it possible to build a heaven on earth, they would be at a loss to know how else to embody it but as this garden, nor could they imagine a single thing that might enhance its splendor. As they wandered blissfully about the garden and made themselves lovely garlands out of foliage of various kinds, they could listen to the birds vying with each other in a dozen different strains of song. Absorbed as they were with these delights, they failed at first to observe yet another. The garden, they noticed, was inhabited by a good 100 varieties of attractive wild creatures, and now they pointed them out to each other. Rabbits hopping out here, over there a scurrying of hares, roebucks resting somewhere else, and young fawns browsing, all manner of harmless animals going about their business for all the world as if they were tame. All of this added immeasurably to their pleasure." End quote. I don't have anything to add to that. I just wanted to pass that nice vision on to you. This next passage is criticizing the clergy in a rather inventive way. He writes, quote, "And recognizing as they do that the fewer there are to share an ample fortune, the better off each participant is, they'll all try deploying scare tactics to clear others off the pitch they want for themselves. They rail against men's lechery, so that with those thus chided out of the way, the women remain at the disposal of the denouncers. They castigate usury and dishonest gain, so that when restitution is made, they can take the very substance which would, they allege, lead its owner to perdition, and use it to procure themselves more ample cowls, or bishoprics and other canonical advancement. And when they are taken to task for these and other such reprehensible activities, their rejoinder is, 'Do as we say, not as we do.' This they take to be a suitable discharge for their every fault, as if constancy and iron rectitude came more easily to the flock than to the shepherds. And most of them in fact realize how many there are who are requited with this answer, but don't grasp its meaning. Friars today would have you do as they say, fill their purses with money, let them into your secrets, stay chaste, all good, upright, holy things. But why do they ask this? Why? So that they can do what otherwise they could not do, if lay folk were all doing it. I don't have to tell you that it takes money to support an idle lifestyle. If you lavish your money on your pleasures, the friar won't be able to take it easy in his order. If you lay folk go chasing after skirts, then there will be none for the friars to chase after. If you don't practice patience and forgiveness, the friars won't risk dropping in on you to debauch your household. I don't need to spell it all out. They show themselves up every time they trot out this justification for the benefit of people who see through it. If they can't trust themselves to be chaste and holy, why don't they just keep to their own quarters? Well, if they do want to be chaste and holy, why don't they stick to that other gospel passage, Christ began to do and to teach? Let them practice first and preach afterwards. I've seen thousands of them in my day, flirting, courting, philandering, and they include some of the biggest pulpit thumpers. Moreover, it's not only women in the world they go after, it's the nuns as well." End quote. So that's a pretty blistering indictment of the clergy at that time. And remember, he's writing in the 14th century. Many of the bloodiest days of the church were still ahead. He writes at one point, quote, "You will know that once upon a time our city boasted some very attractive and praiseworthy traditions that are no longer observed. They have all been displaced by the prevalent avarice that has accompanied the increase in wealth." End quote. I thought that was an interesting observation about the connection between an increase in wealth and an increase in avarice. That's not too surprising. But more importantly, the increase in avarice and the loss of certain praiseworthy traditions. This was something that Boccaccio was observing in his time, close to 7 centuries ago. And the tradition that he names next is not a holiday. He says, quote, "One such tradition was for gentlemen living in one or another quarter of Florence to club together in sufficient numbers to spread the expense." End quote. So he's talking about bachelors or people living together to share the expenses of living together, which could be good or bad. That's not so important. But the point is, when he says a tradition, he means a tradition in the sense of a practice, just something that people do as a way of life, rather than making gingerbread cookies at Christmas time. And he says avarice made a lot of these traditions go unobserved. There are stories of revenge and bloodletting, a lot of fighting on ships. There's one story that has a little clever trick. An advisor, a guy who's giving advice to a king, says, "Your archers are very important in your army, but you need to have some kind of situation where you have more arrows than the enemy." And the king says, "Yeah, of course I need that, but how can I do it?" And the guy says, "All you have to do is make your bowstrings very thin, and then the notches on the arrows, where the arrow clips onto the string at the back, those will also be very narrow. And so then when you've fired a bunch of your arrows and your enemy goes to pick them up, the notches will be too narrow for the enemy's thick bowstring. Whereas when you go to pick up his arrows, he'll have thicker notches, and those will be easy to get onto your thin bowstrings. And so then you'll be able to keep shooting at him, and he won't be able to shoot back at you, and you'll win." And the king says, "Well, that's brilliant. I'm going to do that immediately." And he does it and wins a battle. I thought that was a clever trick that I hope somebody did. Or maybe it was done once and then it wasn't effective anymore because word spread that somebody got smoked in this way and they never let it happen again. So then they all started to use thin bowstrings or something. I don't know. There are a few short lines that I want to read. One is, quote, "There is no doubt that a well-trained warrior will find that any foe, however mighty, is utterly weak and unresisting in comparison with his own passions." End quote. That's a reminder about this message in general. This way of looking at the world in general as a contest between virtue and vice, between reason and the appetites. That we have these different appetites, these passions that are pushing us around. And the good thing to do is to always keep control of yourself, to not be pushed around by those passions. And he says, "A well-trained warrior will find that any foe, however mighty, is utterly weak and unresisting in comparison with his own passions." And that's a message that you'll find in literature really across millennia. This is a very consistent human thing that you see wise people talking about in every century. He writes, quote, "Human wisdom does not reside simply in the recollection of things past or in acquaintance with the present. Men of the highest intellect believe that it makes the greatest sense to base upon such knowledge a prediction of the future." End quote. And I've talked about this before, but I'm very interested in the problem of political prediction because we're very bad at it. Even people who write in the newspaper or make predictions as a profession, they're not significantly better at it than random chance. And if you look at their actual track records, you'll find that your guess is as good as theirs. But this thing that Boccaccio is talking about here, this idea that real intellect comes from predicting the future, not only knowing about the past or about the present, but about knowing something about the future. I think we all feel this. And one of the powers of the physical sciences is that they can make very accurate predictions about the future. When astronomers say this planet is going to be here on this day, and you'll be able to see it in that part of the sky, they're really just making a prediction. But they're making a prediction based on a model that they're working with, which tracks very closely with the way that the planets and the stars move around. And this amazing precision that the physical sciences have achieved is so awe-inspiring that people working in other fields want to try to emulate it, but they want to cleave a shortcut in doing it. They just want to go straight to predicting things based on nothing in particular. And I've talked about this before. I think the path forward for political science has to be to, over the course of centuries maybe, however long it takes, maybe political science today is where astronomy was in the 5th century BC, but if that's where we are, we have to acknowledge that that's where we are, and then work forward based on that, trying to build a model that makes sense, rather than just guessing randomly, which is what people mostly do. Anyway, that line from Boccaccio, from Decameron, stood out to me. He writes, quote, "The laws ought to be even-handed in their application and framed with the approval of those whom they affect," end quote. I don't know much about what was being written about law in the 14th century, so maybe this was a very ordinary thought, but it seems like a relatively early instance of saying that kings should be under the law too, that everyone is equal before the law. The laws ought to be even-handed in their application, that's the first part, and framed with the approval of those whom they affect. So you can only govern with the consent of the governed. The Decameron, of course, is not at all a political science or a law treatise, but it was interesting to see that line in there. He writes, quote, "The power of the pen is vastly greater than people believe who have never experienced it," end quote. All of us who spend too much time scribbling stood up and cheered at that part. One of the stories says outright that if men know that women can cheat too, then men will be less likely to do so themselves. At one point, he's describing a character. He writes, quote, "Now it was around this time that a young Florentine nobleman called Ranieri returned home from Paris, where he had for a long time been a student. He was not concerned to sell his knowledge for gain, as many do, but only to learn the origin of things and their cause, which sits well in a man of breeding," end quote. And he might have been saying this guy was rich and so he didn't want to work, he didn't want to use his knowledge for money, he just wanted to learn for pleasure. But still, that's a nice goal. That's a nice ideal. He was not concerned to sell his knowledge for gain as many do, but only to learn the origin of things and their cause. And he ends the Decameron by speaking as himself. He has a kind of epilogue, and he explains some of the reasoning behind why he wrote what he wrote and how he wrote it, and he answers some of the objections either that he had already received, because perhaps he added it. I don't know if he added this in 1370 and 1371, or maybe at some time before that. But he answers some objections about the ribaldry in the stories and some other things. And he writes, quote, "I have no doubt either that some of you will be telling me that the thing is too facetious and loaded with quips to have come suitably from the pen of a mature, responsible man. To such ladies I owe a vote of thanks, and indeed I am grateful to them, for they are moved by a tender concern for my reputation. Here's how I should answer their objections. I shan't deny that I'm a mature man, and have often acted maturely in my day. So let me address myself to those ladies who find me immature, and assure them that solemn I am not. I am no more weighty than a bobbing cork," end quote. So he's making fun of himself. He says, I can be mature, but I'm definitely not solemn. And he also says explicitly in the epilogue that he wrote it to cheer up women who were down in the dumps, is I think how the translation that I read put it. The translation, by the way, was by one Guido Waldman. This is the Oxford World's Classics edition. And to be honest, when I read that, I was a tiny bit annoyed, because I had read my way through this large book, and as I was reading it, I was trying to get into Boccaccio's head and going, why is he writing this? Is he writing satire? Is he trying to teach etiquette? Is he linking these stories in some way? And then you get to the end, and you get to this explanation, and I felt for a second like I had just spent a bunch of time reading Danielle Steele or something. But now I've thought about it a little bit more, and I don't think that that's the case. And I don't think that this is just my coping with having spent a bunch of time reading a book and trying to come up with a reason why I did it. And if that is why I did it, then, well, you're in it with me too now because you just spent all this time listening to this thing. So we better find a way out of this. No, I really think that it was different because he was writing in the 14th century. To be writing something with women in mind in the 14th century is very different from having done that in the 20th or the 21st century. Not that it's not good to do that now, but it wouldn't be what I would choose. I wouldn't go and pick something that was deliberately written for women. And this also makes me think of another Italian artist, Giacomo Puccini, a composer, a musician, who basically exclusively wrote opera. He's certainly best known for his operas, and I think his operas are among the best operas ever written. And when people think of opera, they think of Italian opera, and certainly Italian opera is very good, not just Puccini, but Verdi also. But there's very good German opera, there's very good French opera, there's very good Russian opera. There's a lot of different kinds of good opera, but Puccini is quite good. And one of the things about his operas is they all feature, I think without exception, a tragic female character. She doesn't necessarily die every time, though she often does die. And it's a different woman. They're all different stories. It's not the same woman every time, obviously. But people have looked into this and looked into his writing and his letters and stuff, and they've decided that he just had in his heart this woman that he loved. Not a specific woman, but this idealized woman that he just felt very powerfully about. And he was conveying that in his music a lot of the time. And Boccaccio and this set of 100 stories that he wrote for women, and not only for women, but about women. If you look at these stories, a lot of the main characters in a similar way are women, or women who are tricking men. They're very mobile women. They're not passive, as we said. I see a similarity there that I don't really know what to do with. I'll just put a question mark on it. These two legendary Italian artists and their view of women, and the way that their art reflected that view. And there's something very praiseworthy in that, also because, after all, women are amazing. And a part of me wants to think that it's sort of shallow if art is oriented around a male view of women, that that's just an extension of something very biological, and that art should fly clear of things like that. And maybe that's true. But another thing about art is that it is intensely human. And there are a few things that are more human than men's attraction to fascination with women. And so this might be the perfect subject for art. I can see it both ways. Anyway, if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope you'll go over to my website and pick up a copy of the edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that I published. I worked with an artist to prepare original cover art that I think reflects a significant aspect of the story that is often overlooked. I added 97 footnotes throughout the book that explain some of the many cultural, historical, literary, geographical references that Mary Shelley uses, and some of the more challenging vocabulary words that she uses. And I did that because I know when I'm reading a book, if I come to a word that I don't know, I stop and go look it up, and that interrupts the reading. I often wish that there were just a definition right there on the page, or an explanation of the reference. What is she talking about? What is that down at the bottom? And so I went through the book, and all of the things that I would have had to look up, I put in a little explanation about them. And I think that that makes the book faster and easier to read because you don't have to go stop and look it up yourself. And at the same time, it doesn't crowd the page. There are rarely more than one footnote on a page. It's often just a little line, so you can jump down, read that, keep going. Anyway, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is an excellent book. It's both good for someone who has read a lot of old fiction and nonfiction, but also for somebody who maybe hasn't read so much old stuff. If they want to get into it, they don't quite know where to start. It's quite short. It's pretty fast-paced. It has a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. It's really as relevant today as it's ever been because of the subject matter that it deals with. My edition has excellent print quality. I'm very happy with how it came out. I have it at a good price, free shipping anywhere in the United States. So I hope you'll go over there and pick yourself up a copy. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.